Okay, so first, as you have mentioned on previous interviews and on your articles, this is quite a particular moment in the capitalism history. We are witnessing all sorts of predictions about the next crisis that will have for sure a deep impact in the world economy. So do you think that this time will open the possibility for structural reforms to capitalism? Or do you think that this will have the same effect or the same consequences that the previous crisis on 2008, 2009, where capitalism sort of restructured in the same way that it was before, just like deepening the mode of accumulation?
Well, it's a good question. Of course, it's a difficult question to answer because we are, well, so far it's an open-ended crisis. So we don't know when the corona crisis per se will end. We also don't know if it will spread to Latin America, Africa, to India. So there are absolutely so many unknowns. I think in general, if the crisis were to last relatively short time, in other words, we are now probably, if you count the beginning in China in December, we are now at like month number 5, approximately 4 to 5.
Yes.
So if we were actually to go to something which looks like a normal life by this summer, I think that the effects would not disappear, but they would be relatively limited. But if, however, we either have a continuation of the crisis spreading to all the different parts of the world, or we have, which I find very likely, we have policies of stop and go. Like, for example, you have hard lockdown, then you have a soft lockdown, then a hard lockdown. This is what we see in China now.
Yes.
Then I think we are probably there in this kind of a situation for maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years. Well, then, if that's the case, then we, I think, actually might experience structural changes in the sense that I think globalization would not look the way that it was looking before, simply because you would not be able to travel. I mean, to start with individuals,
Yes.
then, companies, since they cannot, send people to, let's suppose, China or Laos or Vietnam, they would actually probably sort of also change the global value chains that they're using. Secondly, just so today there was a nice article in the Financial Times saying, from the Chinese perspective, at first they had orders, but they had no people, no workers, because people could not work because they were in a lockdown. Well, now they don't have orders anymore. They have people, the workers are back, but there is nothing to do. So I think we will actually have some structural changes in the way globalization looks like. And last point on that, I think that actually many companies would realize that it could be under some exogenous shocks like this one, having a very sort of a brittle value chain that can break for various reasons is not always the optimal approach. So yes, I think actually we might have some changes at the global level. Now, the second part, and I will not answer it now, but whether we would see some changes internally within countries, that's of course the second type of question.
In this sense, I would like to talk a little bit more about this that you mentioned. A few weeks ago, you wrote a piece for the Foreign Affairs magazine, where you explained that, in your opinion, globalization, as you have recently mentioned, will sort of shatter, and we will witness a revert of what you call natural economies, in the sense that countries will have to develop in a way of self-sufficiency, not counting on the global exchange market as we have known for the past few decades. Could you explain a little bit more about that idea?
Yes, I did not mean actually, and maybe it was unclear in the article, I did not mean that we would go all the way there.
No, of course.
My point, yes, was that actually we start before the crisis from an extremely integrated economy and also integrated individuals. In other words, we are all, of course, very specialized. We have certain sort of advantages as ourselves, as individuals in specialization, and of course, companies likewise and countries likewise. But then, of course, in order to have a very highly integrated global economy, to have division of labor, and to have high specialization with high productivity, you need to have, of course, an economy that is actually globalized. Well, with the sort of undermining of globalization that we also talked in the previous question, it is, the fact that people would tend and companies would tend to less depend on others. Now, if you depend a little bit less on others, that means that you also are no longer as heavily specialized as before. And so that's why I wanted to say, like in the extreme case, and actually this is very clear even today with the corona, in the extreme case, when the economy disintegrates, then you're better off not being specialized. Nowadays, if you're specialized, obviously you can do certain things if there is still demand for them. But if you need to actually cook, have your own water, fix your own electricity, fix everything that has gone bad wrong in your apartment, uh, you know, take the dogs out, clean things. Clearly, we ourselves have become, during this small period of time, less specialized because we cannot rely on others. So that's what I meant. And then, of course, obviously, if there was this was the end point. The end point, of course, in a global sense, would be a total disintegration of the global economy and the return to some kind of self-sufficiency or the natural economy. Now, as I said before, I don't think this will happen, but I actually wanted to highlight the direction of change in which we are going.
All right. And well, you also mentioned there in a few interviews or articles that I've been reviewing, that we've been reviewing, that the major danger about this crisis is the potential disintegration of the social boundaries, social relationships inside the countries. I mean, you just mentioned that international effects will not be the same as the ones within every state, but you pointed out this major danger. So what would be the tools that every state would need to impulse to avoid this social disintegration, to have a bigger impact that it will for surely have? I mean, my main question is it the state's responsibility to amend that social bond, or do you think this will open the door for a bigger intervention in the state in the economy?
Okay, well, on the first question, I first want to say that some people say, look, until now we have not seen much in terms of disintegration. We have not seen, for example, people attacking supermarkets. We have not seen, sort of a social dislocation or anomie. And this is true because, we are basically under the lockdown. We have everybody's afraid, and the world is sort of continuing to function more or less, obviously under these conditions, but more or less as before. I think it is wrong to actually look at a social dislocation and social tensions only during the period of the crisis. During the crisis, as I said, we are all under stress. We actually sort of essentially, our objective is to survive, not to get the virus, to stay at home, and actually to finish with this period. But like in the financial crisis, the political effects and the effects on social solidarity, social cohesion, all of that will be felt later. And that would actually mean that when this sort of the acute crisis is over, the political issues will come up. They would come up because many people would have lost jobs. Many people would have actually, not having had the jobs, would fall in debt. So they would need to repay their debt. Many people would be angry and unevenness, maybe, which we see very clearly in the US, unevenness in the casualty rates. You have poorer people who actually had higher rates of casualty or death than the richer people. So all these political problems would really reemerge once we are out of this acute crisis. And I think this is an objectively a big danger for many countries, particularly for countries that are maybe very unequal or heterogeneous, like suppose the US, Brazil, another possibility, South Africa, another possibility, even European countries like France, Italy, and so on. So then the question becomes, what should governments do? And I think the answer is relatively easy, and this is what they've been trying to do, is you have to ensure for the people who have lost their jobs and who have lost their income, that the state would come in and replace that for a while. As we know now, in Europe, 70 to 80% replacement rates for up to, 6 months or 9 months. And I think that's what, and actually in the US, also to some extent with that check of $1,200 to most people. So I think that the governments are aware of that, and this is the policy they should do. Now, the question is actually whether that will be sufficient, and whether that will be sufficient in terms of maintaining people's purchasing power, and whether that will be sufficient if the crisis lasts longer. Now the US, for example, has currently a rate of unemployment which is over 20%. For many countries, it is not a novelty. You're in Spain now, that Spain have had, 20% rate of unemployment for many years.
The past 40 years, yes.
I'm sorry, exactly. So, but in the US, it's like a novelty because it was a very high rate, which they haven't had in the last 60 years. The rate of unemployment before the crisis was less than 4%. So it's a major change. And so I think you have to take into account actually the likely effects or spin-offs rather of the current situation on social stability in the future.
Well, that is pretty clear. Thank you. These sort of policies, public policies, come in hand with certain modifications in the fiscal policies in every country. There are some countries where the upper classes, the upper income classes, the rich people, as you may call them, are experiencing sort of higher pressures in their fiscal, well, the government is putting more pressure on them, obviously because they are the ones with the higher incomes. So how do you think that this might impact politically in the stability of some countries that are having some serious modifications in their fiscal policies, such as, well, the one that is being proposed in Argentina, or the ones that are being proposed here in Europe? What is your take on that?
I actually think that in a crisis like this, which in my opinion is very similar to a crisis that you faced during the war. And the reason why I say that is because it is a wrong analogy to take always the 2008, 2009 crisis. That was the crisis of demand. That was the financial crisis. It was something that it was not new. This crisis has two components. It has a demand component because people, of course, don't have money. They lose, they become unemployed. They have no income. But it has also a supply component. The supply component is because of the lockdown, the economic activity is down because people cannot go to jobs. So it's not, you cannot solve this crisis simply by thinking from the demand side. I mean, you can increase money as much as you want, but if people don't go and they cannot go to a factory, you're not going to produce anything. So it is not going to be magically created out of nothing. So this is a different crisis. So in a crisis which is an emergency like this, going back to the example of war, you actually have to have policies which would be special and policies that really need to target the rich. Because like in a war, in order to go through this crisis, you have to make some redistribution. That redistribution may not be a permanent redistribution because you might introduce extraordinary taxation during the period of crisis. And I think actually that's a good idea to do that because many countries during the wars have done that. And so this is actually, I think, what I think should be done. And I think some countries might do that. Now, whether it would affect the rich, well, they might not be very happy with it in the beginning, but their interest is also that there should be first a speedy end to this crisis, and their interest is also to preserve social stability, because if there is no social stability, if they refuse to pay that, and there is no social stability, that could be actually, they could be worse off. So I think it really, the governments should really see this as a wartime situation.
Now I would like to that we spoke a little bit about Latin America as a Latin American person, and our magazine being focused at some extent at our national reality. A few years ago, you wrote a paper where you analyzed inequality in Latin America, and you mentioned a particularity that we have as a continent, that our welfare states are somewhat truncated in the sense that social expense doesn't benefit the targeted poor classes, because the biggest part of the poor classes work in the informal sector. I mean, they are not in a position to get social policies or some of the public policies that usually states develop. Has that changed along the years? I mean, do you see a different reality nowadays in Latin America? And if not, as I probably would say, how do you think this particular crisis will impact in our continent?
Yeah, actually, you mentioned there was, of course, a paper that I did also on Latin America, which is one of the few papers, because obviously I'm not a Latin American specialist. But that paper, I have to go back and to finish it and to rewrite it, because there was only one draft. So it is one of the papers that is like sitting on the shelf. Hopefully, I would go back to that. It was an interesting paper also because it actually looked at what was the political, what type of political governments, both governments and presidents, were associated with more pro-poor policies. So it was, I think, an interesting sort of a test to look whether that whole period of more than about 15 years of Latin American movement to the left can be shown to have been econometrically shown to be related to the decline of inequality, which happened in late 90s and the early 2000s. But one issue that you mentioned, I think everybody who actually reads papers or works in Latin America mentions, is the issue of informality. And that issue, of course, is not the same in all the countries. You know, you have that problem more, I think it's more serious in countries like Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and so on, even Brazil. And clearly the informal sector is going to be, seems to me, very strongly affected. First of all, they are not, by being informal, they're actually somewhat outside, as you said, actually, of the altogether outside of the government system of provision of many of the benefits, especially cash benefits. Then they actually have to depend, and that's why Latin America became famous, to depend on government transfers, which were not linked to which are linked to income level and not linked to the occupation or employment status. And that's why, of course, Latin America introduced all these different transfers, which were actually targeted to poor families.
Right.
Now, with a situation like that, I think that actually informal sector would be very heavily affected, because they are in the type of the economy, first, that you have physically to be present at work, which actually puts you in a more dangerous situation compared to people who can just talk over the Zoom and teach, for example,
Exactly.
like I teach now using Zoom. And secondly, the demand for whatever they're doing, they could be services and they could be selling small things and other things, that demand has collapsed. So I think there would be actually a need to maybe expand the type of services or government support for those sectors. So which leads us back to the issue of the previous question, who is going to pay for that? And I think, again, it needs to be really paid on a temporary basis by the rich. So in order not to scare off the rich, one can actually say that these are really temporary taxes which should be there for the duration of the crisis.
Well, you have mentioned, referring to Europe and the United States and some countries in Asia, that there have been some experiences of cash direct transfers to the citizens in order to maintain some purchase levels, some demand levels, but also to cope with the economical effects of this crisis. So I have read, and we have revised some of your latest takes on universal basic income. You're not a big fan of it. And we would like to know, why don't you entirely agree with that policy? And how do you compare the universal basic income proposal to the ones that have been taking place in different parts of the world recently?
You're right, actually. If you read, of course, if you read Capitalism Alone, there is a section, not the big section, but several pages where actually I express quite a few doubts about UBI. I have to say that actually after the crisis, I've changed my opinion on that. I see that the existence of UBI now, for example, in countries like the US, would have been a good thing, because it would actually maintain the floor for everybody. It would actually ensure that you already have a system that would maintain the purchasing power and income of everybody, and you don't need to go through the congressional approval, and you don't need to bring like a special legislation for $2 trillion. So I really see advantages of UBI in very sort of extreme conditions like what we're facing today. And as I said before, just to reiterate, if the US had UBI today, I think it would be in a better position than without it. Now, I have to say that actually why I was not against, but I was doubtful about UBI under the normal conditions is because I thought that it cannot be, first, fiscally, you cannot fund at the same time UBI and continue with all the other fundings which are insurance based, like old age, like pension, unemployment benefits because when you lose a job, sickness benefits when you become sick. So obviously you cannot fund all of that. You have then basically to change. Is UBI going really to replace some of the things, and what should be replaced?
Some proposals tackle this issue, and for instance, the one that from Daniel Raventós, David Casasas here in Barcelona, what they propose is that universal basic income replaces all of the social cash transfers and social unemployment cash and so on, in a way that in a way of admitting that it's impossible to finance every single social policy, but it's also, as you mentioned, a very good way to ensure a certain floor of purchase capability and existing conditions.
No, I agree. Actually, of course, I think technically, I think it is possible. Obviously, since you cannot fund obviously both of them, it is technically possible that you decide really what to replace. Maybe some other things, like for example, pensions would not necessarily be replaced. You can still run pensions, and you can run UBI, but of course, people who have an income which is relatively high, they would be taxed on their UBI. So it is like a negative income tax. So you would not lose all the money that you have dispersed for UBI. Some of that would come back. You would what is called claw back some of the money. But I had one more sort of doubt about UBI. I was concerned that under normal conditions, that UBI might lead to the situation that some percentage of people, maybe 10, maybe 15, we don't know really what percentage, would actually not really be willing to participate in economic activity. In other words, they might say, okay, I'm fine with the UBI and I just leave and not work. That's not likely to happen now, even when you have welfare payments, because the welfare payments, even when they are open-ended, are small, and they're really seen as a palliative measure until you get a job or until, for people who are, for example, sick, until you get better off. So my concern was that in a society where you might have 10 or 15% of people who just don't work because they're happy with the UBI, you might have also 10 or 15% of people who don't work because with higher inequality and higher share of total income from capital, they would have enough. So you might actually end up with a situation that a significant percentage of people don't work either because they don't care to work or because they already have lots of income from capital. So that was the reason, sort of maybe more philosophical reason why I was not very excited about UBI. But and that was, of course, holds for the situations where you have normal conditions. But if we are talking about the conditions like we are facing now with really extraordinary pressure on jobs and on wages, then as I said before, I could see actually nowadays I could see some advantages of UBI. And also, if indeed UBI would not discourage too many people in general under normal conditions from working, if it would be, and we don't know empirically how it would work out, if it would be simply a way of for people to go over a period where they don't have too much income and basically either to reorganize themselves, decide what to do, and so on, I think it would be quite useful. But if, on the other hand, it would have a fairly negative effect on people's willingness to participate in labor force, combined with what I was saying before about 10 or 15% of people who would have very high capital incomes, I think in that case it would not be ideal. So this is my, how should I say, certain of my doubts about the UBI that I actually expressed in Capitalism Alone.
And in this same line of thought, what do you think about the predictions that state that perhaps in the next few decades there will be not we will not need the same amount of labor force to deliver the same amount of needs that we currently deliver, and would that change your opinion on the UBI? I mean, if we lived in a society where we wouldn't need to work as much as we do today, or the amount of hours of labor force hours were distributed more fairly, would you reconsider your opinion, or do you think that paid work or any sort of work should be the nuclear structure around which we should relate as a society?
Yeah, I think that actually, to go back to what you just said, I think that actually work should be a nuclear structure, and I think work is important, not only in terms of what we produce and actually to have more goods and services. I think the work is also a way that people find their own meaning in life. Otherwise, I think that and it's a way of them to participate in the social process. So this is actually what I believe. But as I said, it is really a philosophical issue. So let me go back to an issue that you raised, which is very often raised by the partisans or by those who believe that UBI should be introduced, and that's the issue of artificial intelligence, robotics, and replacement of labor. Now, I do believe that, of course, we would need less labor in the future to produce whatever we are now consuming. But I also think that what we are consuming now will be less than what we are going to consume in the future. In other words, I believe that our needs, and actually I discussed that in the book, I believe that our needs are not limited. And I think it is very clear, if you look through history, that human needs were always unlimited, and that we always, when we look at it from a given point of view, we tended to make the same mistake of projecting our current needs and saying, are these current needs going to be sort of produced with the same amount of labor? And every time you have technological change, the answer is no, you would need less labor. So then people would say, so what do we do with the labor that is then sort of redundant, extra? And they say we have to find an employment for them. But in reality, what happens is that the needs expand as new technology appears. So, new technology, like, for example, has appeared like with the internet, with our ability to communicate like that, and then that becomes our need. So it is not something that I don't think that we have as individuals, other than the essential needs for food and housing and, these basic needs. We have other needs which are actually created by technology, because we cannot conceive of them until technologically they are there. When people did not have, in Roman times, they didn't have, a record player, or didn't have internet, they didn't have a need for the record player or internet, because you cannot conceive of that. So as technology develops, it creates the needs. And as it creates the needs, it requires new people to produce them. So that's why I'm not being, let me just also say that I'm not sort of stupidly optimistic and saying if you technological change, everything is going to be good. No, because you always would have people who would be replaced by technology, and these particular groups of people would suffer. But what I'm saying is that you will not have a generalized excess labor simply because of technology.
All right. Well, those are all our questions. Thank you very much for your time and for your patience with technology. And I hope that we can do this again in another time.
Thank you very much, Juan. I appreciate it.
Don't worry about it.
I'm glad that we did connect, and it's okay.
I'm glad
So,
to. Thank you very much.